Midtown Manhattan, April 1965. The studio lights on West 58th Street burned hot enough to blind a man. On stage 3, one of the biggest late-night shows in America was rolling tape, and sitting in the guest chair under that glare was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the quiet king of Harlem. Across from him, behind a polished wooden desk, the host smiled the way only a man protected by cameras, contracts, and white America's approval could smile. We'll call him Ray Danning. In front of millions watching at home, Danning leaned in and fired off a joke. A cheap, racist shot at Harlem, at Bumpy's past, at his people. The studio audience laughed. The band chuckled. Even some of the crew smirked. Everyone in the room reacted, except one man. Bumpy Johnson just laughed once. A low, tired chuckle, then he went completely still. Hands folded, eyes on the host. No comeback, no threat, no outburst. Just silence. Behind the cameras, 3 of Bumpy's men shifted their weight. A stagehand from Harlem looked down, suddenly nervous. Danning sensed the tension and pushed harder, trying to humiliate the most feared man north of 110th Street. He had no idea the clock had just started. Because in the next 72 hours, without raising his voice, without lifting a hand, Bumpy Johnson would turn that silence into a weapon. And by the time those 3 days were over, Ray Danning's empire would be shaking. But to understand how a man with no badge, no office, and no TV show could break a star with nothing but silence, we have to go back. Back to Charleston, back to Harlem, back to the making of a legend. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born on October 31, 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina. Halloween. A fitting date for a man who would spend his life walking through other people's fears. His father, William, worked the docks. His mother, Margaret, took in laundry. They lived in the Jim Crow South, where a black boy could be killed for looking the wrong man in the eye. As a child, Ellsworth had a slight lump on the back of his head and a stubborn streak that matched it. Neighbors started calling him Bumpy. The name stuck harder than the insults white Charleston threw at him every day. He watched his father get underpaid, watched his older brother William Jr. argue with a white foreman and pay for it. In a place where the law was not on their side, Ellsworth saw a cruel lesson early. Power didn't live in the courthouse. It lived in whoever people were afraid to cross. One night, after his brother's run-in with a white man that nearly ended in a lynching, his father sat him down on the small wooden porch. William looked his son in the eye. "Boy, in this world they don't listen to what you say," he told him. "They watch what you do and who stands up when you walk in the room." Those words wouldn't leave Bumpy's head for the rest of his life. By 1919, Ellsworth was 14. The Great Migration was underway. Rumors floated down from the north about jobs, about jazz, about a place called Harlem where a black man could walk with his head a little higher if he survived it. After one incident too many with Charleston police, his parents made a choice. They put their son on a train heading north. He arrived in New York City with no money, no connections, and a chip on his shoulder big enough to carry a neighborhood. But he was about to meet the place that would turn him into a legend. Harlem. Because Harlem would teach Bumpy Johnson a lesson that would define everything that followed, including why he chose silence on national television. Harlem in the 1920s was a paradox. On Lenox Avenue, poets and painters talked about freedom. Around the corner, bootleggers hustled and knives flashed in alleyways. Churches boomed with gospel on Sunday and numbers runners moved slips on Monday. Bumpy started at the bottom, sweeping floors, running errands, sleeping in cramped rooms with cousins and strangers. He watched. He listened. On 137th Street, he saw his first real shot caller. A Haitian woman with expensive dresses and a steel gaze Stephanie sent. Claire, Madame Queen of the numbers racket. She ran an illegal lottery that touched almost every black working family in Harlem. The police hated her. Politicians took her money. Her men would take your teeth for free. Bumpy was drawn in immediately. He didn't talk much, one old-timer later said. He watched the room like he was counting every breath in it. Madame St. Clair noticed that. One afternoon she called him over, put a stack of betting slips in his hand, tested his memory, crossed streets, names, numbers. He didn't miss one. She smiled. "Use your head as your knife, Ellsworth," she told him. "The gun is for men who can't count." That became his first rule. Win on the front end, not the back end. Think first. Swing last. Over the next few years, Bumpy learned Harlem block by block, who lived above which shop, which cops took money, which preachers looked the other way. He saw how numbers money kept lights on and food on tables, and he saw how the white-toned banks uptown wouldn't touch his people. Power, he realized, could be ugly and still be necessary. But then came the first real shot across his bow. By the early 1930s, another name was creeping into Harlem, Dutch Schultz, a white gangster from the Bronx who saw numbers as just another line item on his ledger. Dutch wanted Harlem's rackets, all of them, not just the money, the control. He sent men up Lenox Avenue. Beatings followed. Storefronts were shot up. Madame St. Clair's policy writers started disappearing. Harlem was at war. Bumpy was about 27 when he stepped into the deeper end. He became Madame St. Clair's enforcer, but he was more than muscle. When Dutch's boys started jamming up St. Clair's writers, Bumpy did something different. Instead of just sending shooters, he walked into Italian territory downtown. He met with a young Charles Lucky, Luciano's people. It was a dangerous play. A black man asking Italians for help against another white gangster. But Bumpy understood something. Dutch was bad for all their business. Too loud, too messy, too hot. He positioned himself not as a beggar but as a partner. "You boys like money that shows up on time, don't you?" he reportedly said. "Harlem's money comes on time if you help keep it breathing." The Italians listened, partly out of respect, partly out of curiosity, partly because they saw something rare. A black gangster who spoke their language, respect, order, profit. Over the following months, Bumpy helped steer Harlem's resistance. Anonymous tips put Dutch's operations in police crosshairs. Certain officers stopped looking the other way. St. Clair fought back with strategy as much as bullets, and Dutch Schultz eventually took a different kind of hit, one organized downtown, not uptown. Harlem noticed. Bumpy Johnson's name started to carry weight, not just as a tough guy, but as a man who could move between worlds and come back alive. What happened next would set Bumpy on a collision course with not just gangsters and cops, but with a whole new kind of power, the kind that lived inside a television screen. And that's when Bumpy met the person who would quietly change everything about how he understood respect and image, his future wife, Mame. She was educated, sharp, and saw the man behind the myth. With Mame, Bumpy started reading more law books, philosophy, newspapers. He began to understand guns controlled corners, but narratives controlled cities. He filed that away. By the late 1940s and early 50s, Bumpy Johnson had done time in prison, including a stretch in Alcatraz, and come back to Harlem with his reputation upgraded, not broken. He wasn't the boss of New York, but in Harlem, if something moved, money, numbers, heroin, stolen goods, someone somewhere checked in with Bumpy. His strategy was simple but lethal. He didn't try to own everything. He focused on leverage. He maintained a quiet understanding with the Italian families downtown, especially the Genovese organization. In exchange for a cut, they recognized him as the point man in Harlem. He kept lines of credit open with lawyers, bail bondsmen, even a few politicians. When a young man from the neighborhood got jammed up, there was a phone Bumpy could call, and he invested in image. He dressed sharp, ate at the same restaurants, tipped heavy, paid hospital bills and tuition for kids whose parents never knew where the envelope came from. He wanted Harlem to feel him in their pocket, not just their fear, one associate recalled. He set rules. No wild shootings near schools. No roughing up old folks. If you broke those rules, you weren't just in trouble with the cops, you were in trouble with Bumpy. It wasn't morality, it was control. One story from the mid-1950s made the rounds for years. A young stick-up crew started robbing small numbers runners without permission. They hit 3 in 1 week. Word spread that Bumpy had gone soft. Instead of sending a squad car full of muscle, Bumpy sent a message. He had a quiet sit-down arranged, neutral ground, a basement under a barber shop. The crew swaggered in, hands at their waistbands. Bumpy was already there, alone. Reading a newspaper, he looked up slowly. "You're not robbing my people," he said calmly. "You're robbing my reputation, and that's a debt you can't pay back." According to those present, he gave them a choice. Work under his umbrella and return what was left of the money, or leave Harlem by sundown and never come back. They chose to stay. The robbery stopped. Another time, when an overeager Italian crew tried to muscle in on a Harlem nightclub, Bumpy didn't threaten them. He just made one phone call downtown. Within 24 hours, those men were pulled off Harlem entirely. Everyone understood the message. Between downtown and uptown, this man could start a war or end one. But there was one problem Bumpy couldn't solve with strategy alone. The world was changing. Television was becoming king, and images of Harlem, often twisted, racist, and one-dimensional, were being beamed into American homes every night. This was a battlefield he couldn't shoot his way into. By the early 1960s, Bumpy was in his late 50s. He had survived gang wars, prison, and shifts in the underworld. Civil rights marches were on the evening news. Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. were speaking out. Harlem was boiling with hope and anger. Bumpy's influence wasn't just in backrooms anymore. Preachers would quietly ask him to calm things down when tensions got high. Small business owners called him before they called the police. He was a criminal, but he was also, in a twisted way, a civic figure. He was like the shadow mayor of Harlem, one old resident said. The newspapers never printed that title, but everybody knew. He'd sit at Wells' Restaurant or Small's Paradise, reading the paper, greeting men in suits and kids in school uniforms the same way. And people whispered stories about how he once paid a kid's way through college, about how a crooked cop transferred out after a private talk with him, about how a downtown boss refused to move on Harlem without Bumpy at the table. And that's when Bumpy made an enemy who couldn't be bought, couldn't be intimidated, and didn't need to step foot above 110th Street to hit him. Not a gangster, not a cop, a television host, Ray Danning. Danning's late-night show was syndicated in multiple cities. He made his name pushing the line, mocking politicians, celebrities, and especially anyone from the streets. He smelled blood in Harlem's headlines. A gangster kingpin made for great copy. Everything Bumpy had built, the respect, the image, the careful balance between fear and favor, was about to be threatened by a man who thought a joke was just a joke. He was wrong. Ray Danning wasn't the biggest name on TV, but he was climbing. A white host in his early 40s, sharp suit, sharper tongue. His show taped in Midtown and aired past 11 p.m., right when bar crowds and night shift workers wanted something to laugh at. His writers loved cheap shots, ethnic jokes, gangster stereotypes. Danning prided himself on not being scared of anybody. In a 1964 interview, he bragged, "If the mob wants to come at me, they'll have to buy a ticket like everyone else." He saw Bumpy Johnson as ratings gold, a Harlem godfather with a criminal record, a perfect target for late-night monologues. Danning, or men like him, are composites of that era, entertainers who built careers turning real people's lives into punchlines for safe audiences. He had something Bumpy didn't, a nationwide microphone and the illusion of legitimacy. He also had sponsors, executives, and a network that would protect him, or so he thought. It started small, a joke here, a punchline there. "Harlem's having a rough week," Danning would say, smirking. "If you see Bumpy Johnson, tell him the Chamber of Commerce called, they want their crime stats back." The audience laughed. One night he aired a skit with an actor in dark makeup, gold teeth, and a fake hump on the back of his neck. Bumpy, they called him, stumbling over bags of money and fried chicken on the stage set. It was ugly, but it was TV. At Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, some of Bumpy's men watched in tight-lipped silence. A few muttered. One wanted to throw a chair through the screen. Bumpy just raised an eyebrow. "What you think?" one of his guys asked. Bumpy took a slow sip of coffee. "Man got a stage, he gone dance," he said. "Question is who's buying the tickets." But Danning had something Bumpy didn't expect. The ability to frame him not as a power, but as a clown. If Harlem started seeing their own legend as a joke, that was more dangerous than any bullet. The jokes escalated. Rumors spread that Danning was planning a full Gangster Week segment, complete with a mock interview about how to run your own ghetto empire. And then came the invitation. A producer from Danning's show reached out. They wanted Bumpy Johnson on the couch. Live, face-to-face. Mame took the call first. She was wary. Bumpy saw the move clearly. This wasn't respect. It was a trap. They wanted to parade a black gangster as a curiosity. To use him, then laugh at him. Some of his people urged him to decline. Others said take the platform and flip it. Bumpy sat at his dining table, invitation letter in hand, thinking. He understood something deep. In the television age, you could lose a neighborhood without losing a single fight. All it took was a bad image. "What you gonna do?" Mame asked him quietly. He folded the letter. "We go," he said, "but we go on my terms." What Bumpy did next surprised everyone, including Ray Danning. He didn't send threats, didn't ask for questions in advance, didn't demand apologies. He started calling people, not reporters, union heads, sponsors, men in suits who owed him favors from 20 years back. A quiet web of leverage that reached places Ray Danning didn't know existed. The first real battle was about to begin, and it wouldn't be fought with fists. A week before the scheduled taping, one of Danning's producers met Bumpy at a private office near Times Square. Officially, it was to go over details. Unofficially, it was to size him up. According to accounts that circulated later, the producer tried small talk, assured Bumpy it would be respectful, that they just wanted his perspective. Bumpy listened without interrupting. Then he asked a simple question. "Who pays for your little show?" The producer blinked. "Well, sponsors, Mr. Johnson, the network, names," Bumpy said, his voice still quiet. "Which companies?" The man listed a few big 1960s brands, a car company, a cigarette label, a liquor distributor whose trucks passed through certain neighborhoods before sunrise. Bumpy nodded slowly. "Good," he said. "Then we understand each other." As he left, he stopped in the doorway. "You tell your boss I ain't scared of his jokes," Bumpy said. "But jokes cost money. Somebody gotta pay the tab." The next 48 hours weren't seen on TV. They happened on loading docks, in back rooms, at quiet lunches, in Midtown restaurants. One of Bumpy's associates had cousins in the Teamsters. Another had a brother running a warehouse that stored equipment used for Danning's show. A few mechanical issues started cropping up. Delayed shipments, misplaced crates, a lighting rig that didn't arrive on time. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to cause headaches. At the same time, a liquor distributor, who'd once needed Bumpy's help smoothing over a nasty union dispute in Harlem, got a call. "Man on that show talks sideways about my neighborhood," Bumpy said. "But you want your bottles in those bars, don't you?" The distributor understood. He made a few calls of his own, quietly suggested to the network that they tone down the Harlem stuff. Danning pushed back. He saw any pressure as proof that he was doing something right. In the writer's room, he demanded they sharpen the jokes. Make the upcoming Bumpy episode Miss TV. The first skirmish ended with no blood, no headlines. But if you were paying attention, you could see it. Bumpy had reached into the machinery behind the show and put his fingers on a few key gears. The taping date was set. Harlem buzzed. Some people couldn't believe Bumpy was actually going on TV. Others saw it as proof that he was bigger than the streets now, a real public figure. In Midtown, Danning prepared his monologue. His writers stacked up cue cards filled with barbed lines about crime, race, and ghetto glamour. He was sure he'd win. After all, what could a criminal from Harlem do to a man backed by cameras, lawyers, and a national audience? He didn't know that Bumpy wasn't planning to out-talk him. Bumpy was planning to out-silence him. In the days leading up to the show, it looked, on the surface, like nothing was happening. But below that surface, the chess game was in full swing. In Harlem, Bumpy had conversations in barber shops and back booths. "No matter what that man says," he told a small circle of trusted lieutenants, "we don't go loud, we don't break nothing, we don't touch nobody." They frowned. This wasn't the old way. "Then what we do, Bump?" one asked. "We listen," he said, "and we remember who laughs the loudest." Downtown, a lawyer who owed Bumpy a decade-old favor took a lunch with a mid-level network executive. A pointed comment was made about being on the wrong side of certain communities. At a union hall, a quiet conversation led to a simple agreement. If that show ever went too far, there might be issues, missed calls, slow setups, unexpected costs. But Bumpy was planning something nobody saw coming. He wasn't just building a safety net. He was setting a trap that would only spring if Ray Danning chose disrespect over decency. If Danning handled the interview with basic respect, the machine would stay quiet. If he humiliated Harlem, the machine would move. The crucial decision came not from Bumpy, but from Danning. On the afternoon before the taping, the host met with his writers. They went over the planned jokes. Some were softballs, some weren't. According to a writer who later spoke off the record, one card in particular became the focus. It was a line that compared Harlem to a zoo and made a crude comment about teaching the animals to wear suits. One writer hesitated. "Maybe that's a little much," he said. "Guy's got a reputation." Danning waved him off. "If I start tailoring my act because some hoodlum thinks he runs a few blocks, I'm done," he scoffed. "The network loves it when I poke the bear." He circled the line, underlined it. At that exact moment, Danning unknowingly made his choice. He chose ratings over respect, cheap heat over long-term smartness, and he activated Bumpy's Plan B. In Harlem, as soon as word leaked that Danning planned to go all the way with the Harlem jokes, Bumpy did something unusual. He gave an order that confused his men. "For the next 3 days after that show," he said, "nobody says my name to nobody, no quotes, no threats, no stories, we go quiet." "Why?" one asked. Bumpy leaned back, eyes half closed. "Sometimes the loudest thing in the room is the man who stops talking," he said. "Let him hear what that sounds like." The day arrived. Outside the studio, fans lined up to see the taping, tickets in hand. They wanted to see the Harlem gangster and the bold host who'd take him on. Inside, crew members, some from Queens, some from Brooklyn, a couple from Harlem, set up cameras, laid cables, checked mics. One stagehand from 135th Street caught Bumpy's eye as he walked past. "Evening, Mr. Johnson," he murmured, half nervous, half respectful. Bumpy nodded. Ray Danning paced his dressing room, rehearsing punchlines. He checked his hair in the mirror, straightened his tie. "Let's make some history," he told his producer. They would. Just not the kind he expected. Everything had led to this moment. Decades of street wars and backroom deals. Years of building quiet leverage. All focusing on a 75-minute taping in a Midtown studio. The band hit a jazzy theme. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Ray Danning Show." Cameras slid into position. Red tally lights snapped on. Behind the curtain, Bumpy stood calm, hands in his pockets. A tailored dark suit. Crisp white shirt, thin tie, hat tilted just enough to show he knew where he was. He wasn't carrying a gun. He didn't need one. He carried something else, the quiet knowledge that half a dozen people involved in this show owed him, or owed someone who owed him. He took a breath. On stage, Ray Danning finished his opening monologue and smirked. "And now," he said, "our very special guest. You know him from the papers. The mayor of Harlem himself." The audience chuckled. "Mr. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson." Bumpy walked out slowly, not shuffled, not swaggered, just moved with the weight of a man who had seen more than most people at that desk ever would. He shook Danning's hand, firm but not crushing. "Pleasure," Danning said, his smile plastic. "Likewise," Bumpy replied, voice low. They sat. The band's last notes faded. The audience quieted. The red on air light glowed. Danning started with soft questions. "How does a nice boy from the South become a Harlem royalty?" he asked, the audience tittering. Bumpy answered politely, briefly, talked about moving north, about hustling to survive, nothing incriminating, nothing dramatic. He didn't give them the monster they were hoping for, so Danning went for it. He looked at his cue cards, found the line he'd circled. "You know, folks," he said, turning to the camera, "some people say having Bumpy here is like inviting the zookeeper to sit in the lion cage." A few nervous laughs. "But I say, why not? Teaches the animals it's possible to wear a suit." There it was. The word hung in the air like smoke. Some in the audience laughed, relieved that the edgy host had gone for the kill. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ugliness. The bandleader's smile froze. The Harlem stagehand looked toward Bumpy, heart hammering. This was the moment. All eyes went to the man in the guest chair. Bumpy Johnson smiled, a slow, weary smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked at the audience, at the band, at the camera, then back to Danning. He let out a short chuckle. "Funny man," he said quietly. Danning leaned in, emboldened. "Well, you know, Mr. Johnson," he said, "we try to keep it light here. I mean, how does it feel to run a whole jungle, so to speak?" He expected anger. He expected a rant he could cut up for the promo reel. Instead, Bumpy did something no one in late-night television was prepared for. He stopped talking completely. He folded his hands in his lap, sat back in his chair, and stared at Danning. No smile now, no scowl, just a flat, unblinking gaze. 5 seconds of silence. On TV, that's an eternity. 10 seconds. Audience members looked at each other, unsure whether to laugh or clap. 15 seconds. Danning shuffled his cards, threw a glance at the band, then back at Bumpy. You okay, Mr. Johnson?" he tried, fake concerned. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving Danning's face. "You talk for a living, don't you?" he said finally. "Go ahead, I'm listening." Then he went quiet again. The air thickened. Danning flailed. He tried another joke. No reaction. He tried to pivot to another topic. Bumpy answered with one-word responses when necessary: yes, no, maybe. The more Danning filled the space, the smaller he looked. Producers in the control room started panicking. This was not the sparkling banter they'd promised sponsors. In Harlem bars, men leaned closer to their TV sets. "Look at him," one said. "Bump ain't giving him nothing." At one point, Danning, frustrated, leaned in again. "Come on, Mr. Johnson," he said, trying to regain control. "America wants to know what makes a man like you tick. Don't go shy on us now." Bumpy looked at him for a long moment. According to a crew member watching from the wings, the studio felt like a church before a sermon. Bumpy finally spoke. "You want to know what makes me tick, Mr. Danning," he said softly. "I know when to talk, and I know when a man just wrote his own ending." A murmur went through the crowd. He turned slightly, eyes flicking up toward the red on air light. "This little red light here," he went on. "That's your power, right? But when it go off, when these folks go home, you still gotta walk in a city you don't really know." He paused. "Where I'm from, we don't have lights, we got memory, and we don't forget who calls us animals." He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just stated it like a weather report. Danning tried to laugh it off. "Hey, now it's all in good fun," he said, forcing a grin. Bumpy smiled again. This time it was colder. He leaned in just enough for Danning to hear him clearly, but the mic still caught every word. "In my world, when a man crosses a line, we don't scream. We get quiet. Then everything around him starts making noise." He sat back. For the rest of the segment, he said almost nothing. Dead air, stilted questions, awkward chuckles. The band played them out mercifully early. As the applause sign flashed and the red light went dark, Bumpy stood, adjusted his cuffs. "Good show," he said mildly and walked off. No threats in the hallway. No angry demands. Just 72 hours of silence about Ray Danning's name. And that was the part he never saw coming. When the taping ended, Danning was pleased with himself. In the green room, he bragged to a few hangers-on. "Did you see his face?" he said, laughing. "These tough guys, you put them in a suit, in a chair, they freeze." A junior producer wasn't so sure. "Crowd seemed a little tense," he muttered. Danning waved it off. The next night the episode aired. Across New York, in living rooms and bars and back offices, people watched that interview. They saw Danning's jokes. They saw Bumpy's silence. They saw who looked rattled, and it wasn't the man from Harlem. In Harlem, the reaction was instant. At Wells, the room stayed quiet for a full minute after the segment ended. Then the comments started. "Man called us animals on national TV," one patron growled. "Bump gone burned that studio down," another predicted, except he didn't. No statements went out. No reporters got calls. No angry quotes appeared in the papers. When asked, the only thing Bumpy said to a curious neighborhood journalist was, "Saw the show." "Thoughts?" the reporter asked. Bumpy smiled. "City's listening," he replied. "That's enough." Then he walked away. Behind the scenes, phones lit up. Not from Bumpy. From bar owners canceling liquor orders attached to Danning's sponsors. From union reps asking questions about safe working environments and racial hostility on set. From a councilman whose district included a big slice of Harlem, calling a network executive. "My constituents are upset. Maybe you don't care about their votes, but I do." Inside the network, a memo went around. It wasn't panic. Not yet. But it was concern. The word boycott started floating in the air, spoken, not by radicals, but by everyday people who had just watched their neighborhood insulted on TV. In the next 72 hours, without saying a public word, Bumpy Johnson would prove a point you won't see in most gangster movies. You don't have to fire a shot to kill a man's career. Day one after the show, Danning arrived at the studio whistling. The ratings slip on his desk showed a bump. Controversy sold. But he noticed two things. First, a couple of his regular crew members, the ones from uptown, barely met his eyes. Second, there was a brief memo from Standards and Practices. a note to avoid racially charged language that may alienate key markets. He shrugged it off. Day 2. One of the show's key sponsors, a liquor company with deep ties in Harlem bars and clubs, called the network. They wanted to re-evaluate their association with the Ray Danning show. No press release, just a quiet decision. Danning heard about it in the hallway. "What the hell does Harlem have to do with my show?" he snapped. "More than you think," an executive told him. Day 3. A union rep requested a meeting with mid-level management. Stagehands were uncomfortable with the atmosphere after the last episode. The rep mentioned the word walkout if things didn't improve. By the end of business that day, Danning got called upstairs. The conversation was polite, corporate. "We love what you do, Ray," the executive began. "But we have to be mindful of the national climate. Things are sensitive out there. We're getting letters." Danning tried to protest. "It's my job to push buttons," he argued. "If a few people in Harlem can't take a joke," the exec cut him off. "It's not just Harlem," he said. "It's unions, it's distributors. It's councilmen. We can't have sponsors nervous right now." They didn't fire Danning that day. They did something subtler. They moved his show. A later time slot, less promotion. A quiet downgrade that sent a clear message: you're not untouchable. And in Harlem, they noticed. In barbershops and diners, men nodded. "Show got pushed back," someone would say. "Looks like Bump handled that." All without a speech, without a threat. Just silence and a memory that moved through the city like a tide. Bumpy's life didn't suddenly become clean. He was still in the game, still navigating a world of drugs, cops, and shifting alliances. The late 60s brought new problems. Heroin on a scale Harlem had never seen, young guns who didn't care about the old rules. He had tense dealings with men like Malcolm X before Malcolm's assassination. There were reports of Bumpy trying to keep certain dealers away from schools, even as the flood grew too big for any one man to stop. But the story of that TV show, of the insult and the silence that followed, became one more brick in his legend. Kids who were too young to watch it live heard about it from older brothers. "Bumpy went on TV, man," they'd say. Host tried to clown him. Bump just stared at him, and 3 days later the dude's show disappeared. The details changed in each retelling. That's how legends work. But the core was always the same. A man from the streets walked into the bright white world of television and reminded it that real power doesn't always live where the cameras point. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson walked into Wells' restaurant in Harlem like he had done so many nights before. He was 62 years old. He took his usual table, ordered his usual food, fried chicken and coffee, by most accounts. Some say he had the day's paper folded beside his plate, stories of riots and war and change bleeding ink onto his fingers. At around 2 a.m., according to witnesses, Bumpy stood up from his chair. He adjusted his hat. Then, without a word, he collapsed, heart attack, on the floor of the place that had seen so many of his quiet meetings. Paramedics came, but the king of Harlem's underworld was already gone. At his funeral, the crowd told its own story. Gangsters, housewives, politicians, preachers, young men in sharp suits who had never met him but who had lived under his shadow. Some came to pay respects to a protector. Some came to see if the legend was really dead. Mame stood with quiet dignity, having known both the man and his myth. The newspapers wrote him up as a racketeer, a criminal, a notorious underworld figure. They weren't wrong, but in the clubs and kitchens of Harlem they added more words. He was wicked, but he was ours. And the story of how he handled that 1965 insult with a stare, a few sentences, and 72 hours of silence became a shorthand for the way Bumpy wielded power. Not always the gun, sometimes the pause. In the decades after his death, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson refused to stay buried. Historians wrote about him. Former associates did interviews. Films and TV shows turned him into a character, sometimes accurate, sometimes not. In the 1997 film Hoodlum, Lawrence Fishburne played a version of Bumpy as a strategist trapped between Madame St. Clair and Dutch Schultz. In American Gangster, his death marked a turning point, the passing of old-school order into a new, chaotic era. More recently, series like Godfather of Harlem tried to capture his role as a bridge between the streets and the civil rights movement, between Harlem and downtown, between the world of crime and the world of image. A Harlem historian once said, "Bumpy Johnson was a contradiction you only find in places under pressure. He was the man you feared, and the man you called when the system failed you." Another writer put it more bluntly. He ruled with a ledger in one hand and a book in the other. People who knew him said he could quote poetry to a college student, then switch and talk numbers with a bookmaker like he never left the corner. And that TV story, whether every detail happened exactly that way or not, it captured something true about the man. He understood that by the 1960s, a new kind of battlefield had opened. Not just streets, screens. In a world where white hosts could reduce black neighborhoods to punchlines, Bumpy chose a tactic most wouldn't expect from a man with his reputation. He didn't storm the studio. He withdrew. He weaponized absence. Silence became his closing argument, because he knew the people in power couldn't stand a vacuum. When he stopped talking, their own sponsors, workers, and viewers started filling that silence with questions. In a quiet moment years later, Mame is reported to have said, "He wasn't perfect, but he knew when to keep his mouth shut. That's what kept him alive, and what got some of his enemies buried." Today, you can walk through Harlem and still hear his name in barbershops, on stoops, in between stories of new hustlers and old legends. Not just for the deals he cut, but for the way he carried himself when the bright lights were on. He sat in a chair, got called an animal on national television, and made the man with the microphone look like the smallest person in the room. What happened in that Midtown studio in 1965, or in the countless retellings of it, became legend in Harlem. Not because Bumpy Johnson pulled a gun, not because he flipped a desk, but because he understood something most people never really learn. Power isn't how loud you can get. It's how quiet you can afford to be. In the streets, everybody talks. The ones who last know when not to. Bumpy Johnson was a criminal. There's no romance in the damage his world did. But inside that life, he grasped a hard truth about respect. When you've built real leverage, favors, loyalty, fear, gratitude, you don't always need to explode at disrespect. Sometimes you just step back and let the weight of who you are do the talking for you. For 3 days in 1965, a man who lived by his words on television got a crash course in that principle. He felt the silence closing in. He watched phones stop ringing. Sponsors step back. Executives look at him differently. Bumpy never gave a press conference. He didn't need to. Picture that final image. A red on-air light glowing in a hot studio. A host cracking a cruel joke expecting a reaction. And across from him, a man from Harlem in a dark suit just watching. Not cowed, not amused, just measuring. Then days later, that same red light flickering for a show that suddenly isn't as important as it used to be. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson, 1905 to 1968. Gangster, guardian, strategist in a world that rarely gave black men the luxury of choosing how they'd be seen. If this story of power, image, and the weaponization of silence hit you, there's more where it came from. Check out our next deep dive into the legends the history books footnote, but the streets never forgot. And down in the comments, tell me, what's more dangerous, the man who shouts or the one who just sits there and lets you talk? Until next time, remember, real power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just goes quiet.